Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 2. "Hey, Mr. Talbot." Garrett Wood pulled off his cap and stood in the doorway of Whitaker's grocery. The water in the street had gotten deep enough to cover the top step. Little rivulets were flowing inside and puddling near the threshold. Garrett stared at his bare feet. They weren't too muddy. He stood on one foot and rubbed the other against the back of his pant leg, then switched. "Is that you, Garrett?" Old Man Talbot was stacking cans on a shelf behind the counter. He did not turn around. The lights flickered, and Garrett heard the Delco plant that sat out behind the store on a cement slab run through rough for a second. Then the motor caught up again. "Mama sent me after chickpeas and 10 pounds of flour," Garrett said a little louder. He waited, fiddling with his burlap sack. He looked from the bolts of brightly colored cloth to the fragrant Florida oranges in the crates stacked by the door. There were pairs of leather shoes hanging from a wire strung over the counter. He stared at them with genuine longing, then looked back down at his feet. Little cuts crisscrossed his skin, and one of his toenails was black from stubbing. He cleared his throat politely. Mr. Talbot finally faced him. "I'll get them for you, but you tell your mamma that she had best come see Mr. Whitaker about her account." "Yes, sir, I'll tell her." Garrett said it quickly, and glanced back outside. Willard and Earl Harland were waiting for him across the street. Willard was throwing pebbles into the muddy stream of water that had appeared 2 weeks ago behind the courthouse. It was twice as wide as it had been a few days before. "Hurry up, Garrett!" Earl shouted. Garrett pretended he hadn't heard. Mr. Talbot laid the flour on the counter. The cloth sack was blue with green stripes. Mr. Talbot bent down, then straightened again, placing a pile of 8 or 10 empty flour sacks on the counter. "You can take these too. I had to spill them out. The flour got wet and rotted." Garrett hid a smile. Mr. Talbot knew that the colored flour sacks meant a lot to Mamma, because she used them to make dresses for the girls. Ivy and May were barely 4 and would be delighted at the gift. Ginny, at 9, was beginning to wish for store-bought clothes. Garrett tightened his hands into fists for an instant. He was going to find a good job in Greenville, or Rolling Fork, or Yazoo City, or somewhere, and he was going to make it so that Mamma would never have to worry about money again. As he always did, he felt guilty for a few seconds about the money he and Molly had hidden up the lightning tree. Then he promised himself for the 100th time that he wouldn't squander a penny. He would use it to make that good job possible. "Come on, Garrett!" This time it was Willard. Mr. Talbot was scooping the chickpeas into a paper bag. He rolled the top shut and tied the parcel with twine. Garrett put the groceries into his sack. Then he nodded and smiled his way out the door, plopping his cap back on his head. He slung the sack over his shoulder and waded back into the brownish water. He winced, sloshing across the patch of sharp red gravel that Whitaker's spread in front to keep down the mud. He shook his head. It sure wasn't doing the job this year. "Let's go see the cottonmouth they killed out at the Indian Mound," Willard said as Garrett got closer. "Earl saw it. Didn't you, Earl?" "Sure did." Earl slapped a mosquito on his arm. "It was lying on a tombstone up there, one of the old Heath Smith graves. They hung it on the fence. Biggest moccasin I ever saw." Garrett hesitated. He wouldn't mind seeing the snake, but he didn't want to go with Willard and Earl. Lately all Earl thought about was smoking cigarettes and flirting with girls. All Willard was just plain mean-hearted. "I suppose I'd better just get on home," he said evenly. "Why, you afraid of snakes?" Willard threw another rock. The muddy water splashed up in a little plume. Garrett shook his head, refusing to rise to the bait. Willard grimaced. "I know," he said slowly. "You have to get home so you can go meet up with that darky gal, don't you? She's just your best friend, isn't—" "I told you to leave off about Molly," Garrett cut in. Willard lowered his voice. "You know what folks say about you?" Garrett hitched the sack higher on his shoulder and started walking. There was no point in arguing with the Harland brothers. His daddy had always said that some folks would live and die ignorant, no matter what. Garrett felt that stab of sadness that thoughts about his father always brought. and he continued on down Court Street toward the levee. A truck horn blared. Garrett saw Mr. Wade's truck rolling toward him, sending up sprays of water from either side of the tires. "Go on, then," Willard shouted. "We didn't want you to come anyway. We was just being polite." Garrett half turned and touched his cap in a mock salute. Then he quickened his pace, making his way around a deep puddle at the toe of the levee. He started up the slope, following the path. Halfway up the levee he turned and looked back down Court Street. The tin roof of the courthouse matched the gray sky. Beyond it, people's houses stood along a graveled road that ran east between muddied, unplowed cotton fields. The smell of frying bacon tickled at Garrett's nose, and he wished he had money for a restaurant meal. Sighing, he went up the slope of the levee, nodding politely at 4 men who were unloading sandbags. There were a number of trucks and cars up on the levee. Convicts in striped uniforms went past him heading north, carrying shovels, their legs chained together. Farther along, a crew of colored workmen were laying down sandbags. Garrett was glad he hadn't gone with Willard and Earl. He had to stop off at old Mrs. Hampstead's place and carry in her wood. Then he had to finish tearing the tie vine off the cowshed and muck out the chicken coop before he went to meet Molly. And he wanted to clean up the length of rope he'd found. He walked faster, shivering as it began to rain hard again.